Afghanistan, a distant country visited by few British civilians. Yet a country torn apart by a war which has raged for more than a decade. Thousands have died. In 2012 alone, over 2,700 civilians were killed by pro- and anti-government forces. Improvised explosive devices, aerial attacks and shootings accounted for the overwhelming majority of these deaths. In that same year, the British military death toll in Afghanistan reached 44. But amongst the military deaths, there is another recurring cause: suicide. Remarkably, in 2012, more British troops and veterans took their own lives than died in action in Afghanistan. It has been reported that 21 serving troopers and 29 veterans killed themselves in that year alone. What has caused so many serving and former soldiers to resort to the desperate act of taking their own lives? To answer this question, we must go back to the origins of the invasion in 2001. Are the stated motives still persuasive? Do the public feel clear about why Britain invaded and, more than a decade later, why the occupation continues? Do they know how many British soldiers are still out there? It's a simple question, which we put to the public. In your view, how many British combatants are in Afghanistan, and why did Britain invade Afghanistan in the first place?
Humanitarian reasons for the latter question, and I would have thought that we've drawn down to under 1,000, maybe down to a few hundred.
I'm not sure how many soldiers there are there. Geopolitics, as usual, yeah.
In your view, how many British soldiers are in Afghanistan, and why did Britain invade in the first place?
I have no idea about the number. I'm assuming, being allies and part of NATO, they had to support the Americans, so that's the real reason why they invaded.
As someone who is from Sweden, I can't really tell how many British soldiers are there, but I know that there are, in my opinion, sometimes too many. Could have been because of the America's war on terror speeches here and there, but I can't say.
Maybe to show that they're Great Britain and they want to. I hope that's positive to show that they actually want to do something positive out of, because war and those kind of stuff I don't really like looking at and the news, but I hope if they're going to do something like that, they do it for the better, not the worse.
So that's what the public said. We asked our experts for their views on the original justifications for Britain's involvement in the war in Afghanistan.
The stated goal that Britain went into Afghanistan and invaded Afghanistan is to protect the national security of its own, and also to prevent Afghanistan to be a haven for the terrorist attack, to attack Britain, of course. This is stated by Blair when the army, British Army, went in, and recently also stated by Cameron, the Prime Minister, British Prime Minister. But people, in fact, accuse Britain that the attempt of Britain to go in Afghanistan is a kind of neo-colonial attempt, and for other strategic interest. The goal stated is not right. There are other, in fact, there is hidden agenda in there.
Estimates of civilian deaths in Afghanistan vary considerably, but how clear are the public about how many civilians have died in Afghanistan? In your view, any idea how many civilians have been killed by the Western forces in Afghanistan?
I would imagine it's in the tens of thousands.
Thousands, I think probably thousands, hundreds, because you have to also think about how they're going to get these soldiers. You know, they're probably using natural civilians actually to, you know, get to the actual place of where the soldiers are, and that could be a problem. So I think probably another thousands as well. You know.
I'd say in the hundreds, maybe under 1,000. As a guess.
Too many. Don't know how many, but any death's too many.
So, as we can see, there is a lot of uncertainty about the number of civilians killed in the conflict. Can our experts provide a clearer picture?
There are some statistics there, but rough statistics that from 2007 up to 2012, about 14,700 were killed. But last year, the statistics was 2,700. That is only for 2012. In fact, many of them also died of lack of medication, displacement, and other reasons, in fact. I believe there are more than this estimate and statistics who were killed.
Many civilians have died at the hands of anti-government forces, but the British media spends little time presenting the feelings of Afghan civilians who have lost innocent loved ones to attacks by British forces. So we asked a sensitive question on the streets of London. How would the public feel if their family members were killed without warning due to, for example, an air attack by another country? And what implications does this have for the Afghans?
How would you feel if your innocent loved ones were killed due to, for example, an air attack by another country?
I'd be out for revenge. I'd have my own jihad.
They must feel bitter, and they must probably feel a lot of pain, and they doubtless some will feel hatred. I think that would be a normal response, irrespective of the colour of your skin or nationality. If somebody killed one of your loved ones in a human capital loss.
I think most of the feelings that the people over there would feel from losing loved ones would be frustration, anger, and just annoyance that nothing's really being solved.
How would you feel if your innocent loved ones were killed due to, for example, an airstrike by another country?
I will be very upset, and I will try to do my best to retaliate.
They probably have a lot of enmity towards whatever countries have troops in Afghanistan, basically. So, yeah.
The public's response appears clear. Can our experts provide further insights about the reaction on the ground in Afghanistan to such strikes? Joe Glenton, a former British soldier in Afghanistan, recently published his book revealing the horrors of the war. He claims the situation on the ground is very different to government and media reports.
Okay, the main differences between the mainstream media coverage of Afghanistan and what's actually going on the ground is just a case of facts, I think, and that was something I noticed when I was in Afghanistan, that I would be sent out newspaper clippings by relatives, and they would be radically different from what we were being told and what we were aware of on the ground. And I think the reason for that is there's been a shift in terms of a kind of increasing closeness between the media and the military, wherein only journalists who are approved by the military get access, and only journalists who are trusted to say the right thing and follow the party line. And that was very, very apparent. And that accounts for the big gulf we see between media coverage and reality.
The war was justified as being in the national interest, to protect Britain and its way of life. In the light of what has happened since, do the public feel safer from terrorism since Britain invaded that country?
Do you feel safer from a terrorist perspective as a result of the Afghanistan conflict?
On balance, I'd say I don't feel safer, no.
No, not really. Terrorism will happen whether we've got that war or not.
I don't at all. There's been a lot of terrorism, for example, in London, America, and I just feel that this is going to continue going on. We don't know how our country's going to end up by, let's say, 2020.
In terms of terrorism, do you feel safer now that the West did launch this initiative in Afghanistan, the military initiative in Afghanistan?
Okay, first of all, no. And the answer no is because you can never stop terrorism.
I don't think that's any bearing on how I feel either way.
I don't think so. If anything, as you were sort of intimating, I think it's probably a bit more because there's a lot more angry people over there.
It seems the public are far from convinced that they're safer now as a result of the war. Are they right? We asked our experts.
I don't think so. I mean, if we save the years from 2001, when Britain went into Afghanistan, there have been so many terrorist threats, and there were quite a few terrorist attacks. Of course, we know the main one was 7/7, that is 2007, in London. And of course, there was another one at the Glaxo. And also, recently, there was a soldier killed in Woolwich, as this is well known. So, in fact, looking at these terrorist acts, we don't think that Britain became safe because of the invasion at all.
Okay, so the war was justified with reference to kind of protecting the British way of life, and I think 12 years on, we can really look at that and kind of knock it down as an excuse, just because of what we see in our own society. And when you go to other countries and invade them, and those populations have a diaspora in your own country, you really can't help but affect that community. And the main example of that, I think, is Islamophobia. And the fact remains that if you go and attack people who happen to be Muslims overseas, then that will have an impact on your own country as well. And part of that, one of the results of that, is the rise of groups like the EDL and the BNP, who've shifted their rhetoric. They're very opportunistic, and they've shifted their rhetoric away from what used to be anti-Irish, anti-black, to being anti-Muslim. And it's very important we understand that that space has been created by the three main parties, all of whom agree that the wars should be conducted. And of course the far right will jump into that void and start to peddle their racist politics.
And so we turn to the suicide statistics. Did the public know that in 2012 more soldiers and former soldiers killed themselves than were killed in the theatre of conflict? And why has this happened? Here's what they said.
In 2012, more British troops involved in the Afghan conflict actually committed suicide than were killed in the conflict.
Yeah.
Any views why that might be?
It's worse for the American soldiers. I mean, I feel great pity for our servicemen and women. They're either in prison or they're on the streets homeless. It's a horrible job they're doing.
Why would they do that? Maybe they go to do that because they don't value their own life too much, which is not good.
The stress from being over there, the pressure of it all, being away from their own friends and family, and the thought that if they did actually kill someone, whether it be soldier or civilian, it has huge repercussions. Even if it's to save your own life, it's hard to kill someone.
In 2012, more British troops actually committed suicide than were killed in the theatre of war. Why do you think that might be?
I think post-traumatic stress. I think the stress of being over there and the conditions, and coming back and maybe realising that the reasons for going to war weren't set out, weren't clear, so they didn't feel like. I don't know. I can't speak for them, but I would feel like the reasons weren't clear and you're not sure what you're fighting for.
Probably because of what they've seen. They thought they signed up for something that was in protection of their own country, whereas really when you get there, you see more civilians dying than soldiers. That's always war, and some people brush it off as casualties, but it really isn't. When you're there, when you see things happen, it's completely different.
Probably distress. I think the armed forces are treated shabbily by the government. When you think they're out there, politicians start wars, soldiers get killed, and then they lose their jobs, made redundant. I think it's probably the desperation, just things like that.
Varying views from the public. We turn to our experts and ask them why soldiers, trained for war and hardened to danger, might commit suicide.
I think this is because the soldiers themselves, they don't think the war is just war, and they don't think that it is justified with all these killings. I mean, their opinion is similar with most of the public in Britain. They also think the war is not justified. And of course, when the soldiers think that way, they lack the will to kill, and they lack the will to fight, of course. And therefore, they commit, some of them, they have this struggle inside them. So they believe the best thing to do is to commit suicide. And this is why we have so many suicides last year. Last year, about 50 personnel were committed suicide. And there are many who are suffering what they call PTSD, that is post-trauma stress disorder. Many of them, they suffer from this, and they are potential suicidal people.
For me, no amount of training can prepare you for that kind of activity. I think the thing with war, it's very interesting. A lot of people go on about war as human nature, but I think clearly that's not the case, because the experience of war tends to rip even the most robust soldiers apart in some sense. Very often after they've left the service, which is why it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's post-trauma. But yeah, I mean, you have to expect it to some degree. All you can do is mitigate it, or in the best case scenario, not go to war unless you absolutely have to. And clearly that's not the case in Afghanistan. And also we have to understand that there's an unwillingness, in my experience, in the military to recognise the problem. In my case, for example, I found that there was an effort to diagnose my post-traumatic stress disorder down to the next level, which is adjustment disorder. And as I understand it, talking to doctors who work with the military, that's actually, in the past at least, a matter of policy. Now, whether that's because it's expensive to treat, or because to recognise it would be to recognise the problem and it would demand a response, I'm not sure. But there has been a resistance to that. And as long as you send young men to war, they will come back badly damaged, and a percentage of them will kill themselves.
And so we are faced with the biggest question of all. Looking back and considering the deaths in combat and suicides away from it, do the public believe the human cost of going to war in Afghanistan has been worth it?
Looking back, has the human cost of going to war in Afghanistan, the civilian and military deaths and suicides, been worth it?
No. No. Because we will be negotiating with the Taliban, quite rightly. We should have been negotiating with the Taliban a decade ago.
No, of course it hasn't. Definitely nothing will change. As I said, they'll go away. The terrorists, Al Qaeda and whoever, the Taliban, they'll move back in again, and they'll still be fighting them in 20 years' time, unfortunately.
I don't think any war's worth the human cost. No, certainly not.
And the very last question, if you add up the toll in terms of civilian deaths, military deaths, and indeed the suicides, do you feel that human cost is justified? Is the Afghanistan war worth it in regard to those deaths?
It's easy to say no, of course, but on balance, there are a number of initiatives that have to be taken into account and carried out in an attempt to secure our security and those of other peaceful nations. So whilst I'm certainly not a pro-war person, I would have to say that in all probability it's been done with the right motives in mind.
I don't think any conflict is worth it in human terms, but because I don't know about the reasons why, or intimately know the reasons why, I probably couldn't comment really to understand whether it was worth it or not. But I'd hazard a guess, be 90% sure and say it wasn't.
No, that was not worth it. That was not not worth it, not at all.
Does it justify the war, how it played out? No, it's not justified, but I think something had to be done in Afghanistan.
Those were the views of the public about the cost of the Afghanistan invasion. We turn to our experts for their perspective on this central question.
taking the material and the human sacrifices, so many human sacrifices, into account, I don't think it is worth it at all. I mean, human cost is not only British soldiers and British civilians, it's also Afghani civilians and also Afghani military personnel and so on. I think the cost, it is too much, the cost is too much. Therefore, it is not worth it. And still, the war is going on, and there is no sign of defeating Taliban. So it would continue, and continue costly in money-wise and in human lives.
I think before we ask that question, has the human cost in Afghanistan been worth it, we really have to try and get at the real reasons we went to Afghanistan. And we need to get past the list of excuses which have been given at various points over the last decade plus about why we're there, and we need to get past ideas about democracy and women's rights and human rights and all these things which you will notice a new one comes up and then it fails and they come up with another excuse to be there. We need to look at the real reasons, which I think are quite clear, and they're not obscure if you care to look. You know, this is an issue of geopolitics. Afghanistan's in a very important location. It's always been of interest to foreign empires and powerful foreign countries. And of course the economic driver, which is huge amounts of oil and gas in the Caspian. Afghanistan itself is a very rich country, not in terms of oil, but in terms of mineral deposits and certain types of metals. And we have to look at who's going to benefit from those things. When we ask, is it worth it? And I think the most cursory kind of look at the situation says no, it hasn't been worth it because we haven't benefited in this country. I don't think the Afghanistans have benefited. When you look at the people who've benefited in Afghanistan, you're talking about development contractors, warlords, opium barons. So some people have profited, and I'm sure a lot of big American companies have profited, but certainly it hasn't protected our way of life or made us more secure, and that was the stated aim initially.
Few British politicians are comfortable when news stories reveal the thousands of Afghan civilians killed by Allied forces in Afghanistan. Even fewer speak of the feelings of devastated relatives dealing with the loss of their innocent loved ones. Who dares consider the reaction this creates, the sense of vengeance and anger towards the very forces claiming to liberate this war-torn country? It is natural that the West presents its actions in a positive light. However, it is also equally clear that the longer this military action continues, the more anger will be generated amongst the civilian population, as more civilians will inevitably die, together with British soldiers, through combat and suicide.